Hello everybody and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Today we are going to be continuing on with our look at the monk character class. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at what exactly you want to do to build this character so that we go into that optimized damage dealer that I talked about before in the previous episode. Because as you'll see from taking a look at these various disparate class abilities, while they all, for the most part, are appropriate flavor and roleplay wise, thematically for the monk, they definitely contribute a lot towards the confusion regarding where the monk should fit in as far as how you build them and what kind of character they ultimately should be. So let's go ahead and get started here. Oh goodness, how could I ever forget? I'm joined today by the learner initiate of lore and the storyteller in training, Nora, my most adorable co-host. Now then, what do you say we get going on this, little one? So what race do we want to build our monk around? For something that's a little bit more optimized, we have two choices that are going to serve really well here. First off, as will be the case with just about every class, humans do exceptionally well. With that +2 modifier, they can throw into any stat, letting us bump up our strength score further. The extra feet giving us some more combat flexibility and options, and the extra skill points to help a class that would otherwise be very much skill starved. We cannot go wrong with this particular character class. Also, there's no real penalties to speak of. The other option, and it's the one that we're going to be running with throughout this entire guide, is the dwarf. Dwarves get just the right stat modifiers with a +2 bonus to their constitution and their wisdom. The only penalty they get is to their charisma at a -2, which honestly, a -2 to a stat that is the only dump stat for the character class. And since we're going to be looking at this running with a point buy system, having these bonuses to 2 stats that are essential to the character class will allow us to free up some extra points to put into our strength score. On top of this, dwarves get a dark vision out to 60 feet, which is incredibly handy to have, and some people look at that and go, oh, it's only up to 60 feet. Well, the thing is that a monk is not a ranged attacker, or at least they're not a long range or even a medium range attacker. They're all going to be short to close range, so only having a dark vision out to 60 feet is not that huge of a hindrance, it's only a benefit. To top it off, the race also gets a +4 racial bonus to their combat maneuver defense against bull rush and trip attacks. Goodness, this one has a lot to say about the character build this time around. But with all that said and done, I will be coming back to combat maneuver defense and some other different types of armor class that come into play. I had neglected to bring this up with the 2 fighter builds before. I could have brought them up, but I wanted to kind of compare and contrast and show some differences here because both the monk and the fighter class fulfill much the same role in that they are close combat specialists. The biggest difference being the fighter doesn't get a whole lot of abilities and is almost entirely dependent on their equipment for dealing damage, whereas the monk, they get a lot of abilities, but it's all short range, and at a certain point their equipment stops being beneficial for them, or at least isn't as beneficial or effective as other options. But with that said, we'll cover that another time at a later video. I will continue on with this for now. Now, we need to talk about how we line up our stat array, and Treant Monk really set the standard for build guides for the D20 system, so Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, but even still, you can make an argument for using this system with other games. But for now, the most important stat we need to focus on is strength, and that is color-coded blue. This is going to be absolutely essential for you. Anything coded blue is going to be perfect and is always going to be useful, or if it's ever not useful, it's in the most rare of circumstances. Next up will be green. Green is something that is going to be pretty useful most of the time. There are some instances where it's not going to be the most effective option, but anything green is definitely a solid get for your character. Anything color-coded yellow is mediocre in its usefulness. It's not necessarily bad, but there's probably some better options for you. These might be some abilities that are more flavor or are not always going to be applicable, but when you have them, it is nice to have them. Anything red is just from at least a mechanical standpoint, and even sometimes from a role-playing standpoint, not that great. And it's an ability that doesn't make sense, or is entirely useless to you, or is never going to come up as being useful for you or your particular build. Now, you'll see here for the stats that I have arrayed out, strength is our highest. The next one, or the next most important one, is actually a three-way tie between dexterity, constitution, and wisdom. The reason for this is all of these affect the aspects of your character that are important, and some of them do impact class abilities as well. Which ones are more important to you just kind of depends more on what you want to emphasize or pay attention to. Just bear in mind that something like dexterity affects your defense, your initiative score, several skills, and your reflex saves score. Constitution affects your hit points and your fortitude save, and with hit points, you kind of need those for staying alive in frontline combat, because especially early on and even mid-game, you're going to be taking hits more often than not, unless you put your opponent down fast enough. And then wisdom affects your will saves, arguably one of the most important saves in the game, just with the whole host of abilities that can affect it. And this ties into a number of key monk abilities that are going to be incredibly useful for us. Then after that, we have intelligence, which is useful, but it's not really the main focus here. Really what you're getting out of intelligence is your number of skill points, and that again, it's just not the main focus, and it's not impacting a whole lot else. And then we have charisma, which, as we discussed, is the dump stat. Now, one thing to note here, and I made a note of it on the image, is that this is what your stat array should look like after your stat bonuses from playing a dwarf and decreasing intelligence and charisma. When it comes to doing a point buy system, the higher up your stat goes, the more expensive in these points it becomes. But the trade-off is everybody's stat starts off at a baseline of 10, and you can decrease those stats in order to get a few extra points to put into other things. The more you decrease a stat does not mean you get more points, you just get 1 point for every point you decrease. Buying up stats does increase in cost though. And just as a side note, if you're doing the roll 4d6 system where you are rolling 4 6-sided dice, taking the 3 highest and re-rolling any ones, and you do this 7 times and take the 6 highest numbers to get your stats, you will be coming up with better than average stats, even maybe sometimes some incredible stats. But even still, you're going to want to focus your highest number in the particular layout setup here that I have for you, with strength being most important, 3-way tie with dex, con, and wisdom. Intelligence, whatever you want to throw in there, just make sure charisma is your lowest stat, because intelligence is going to be much more useful than charisma by far for you. Now, with that said, let's get on to the meat of this issue, and this is going to necessitate that I break this up into 2 separate videos, so let's just get started. It's the class abilities, and monks get an entire array of different abilities, starting off with Unarmed Strike. At first level, your unarmed strikes are going to deal 1d6 points of damage, plus your strength modifier, and it will increase by 1 die size for every 3 levels you go for. So, darn right, you tell them. Cunning and witty insight as always, my little one. So that means by level 4, you're dealing 1d8 points of damage, then 1d10, then 2d6, and on and on and on. This is incredibly handy to have, and it also means your monk is proficient with unarmed attacks. No other classes, unless they spend a feat or they're going down a specific archetype, is going to be proficient with their unarmed attacks, and you're just flat out dealing more damage. Starting off, you are going to want to have your some various weapons and armaments on hand, just because you need different enchantments to overcome different creatures' resistances and damage reductions. But after a certain point, well, like when you start hitting the 2d6 or even the 2d8 range for damage, and you get some more magic items that help boost your unarmed attacks, you're probably going to be relying less on your weapons and just go to being an unarmed monk. Now, the next ability that absolutely is the big part of what sells the monk character class is Flurry of Blows. This lets you attack like you had 2-weapon fighting, and your full strength bonus applies to all of your attacks. You are taking a slight -1 penalty to both attacks, meaning you're only getting a +3 instead of a +4 for both attacks, but you are the only class that is naturally going to be attacking twice unless the fighter or the paladin have the cleave feat. But that requires a bit of setup, and your Flurry of Blows does not. It only requires that you have a target in front of you that you want to pummel. The next thing that monks get is bonus feats, specifically 4 bonus feats that the monk is allowed to ignore the normal prerequisites for. And while there's a longer list, the recommendations here are as follows: Improve Grapple, Combat Reflexes, which Treant Monk had originally marked down as yellow, but for me, I definitely count it as a green just because you're going to have a better than average dexterity modifier, and so you're going to be getting a few extra attacks, and you're bound to have some opponents, unless your DM is playing unreasonably smart for all enemies at all times, you're going to have opponents that are moving through your threatened area that you will be able to affect with your with some attacks of opportunity. So being able to deal more damage, which is the point of this build, is just something you want to grab hold of. That said, Improved Grapple does just kind of work better because what self-respecting martial artists wouldn't develop themselves into an excellent grappler? I mean, the ancient warriors of the past practiced wrestling across so many different cultures, and it would make sense for a monk in a fantasy setting where there are spellcasters who are an absolute nightmare unless you are pinning them down to have improved grapple. But then again, there's some stylistic and story and even different martial aspects and thinking that can go into why you wouldn't pick this. But again, we're looking at this from more of a mechanicals perspective. I just like throwing in story. Then we also have Deflect Arrows and Dodge. At level 6, the list opens up a bit more, but you are going to want to take more of a look at Improved Bull Rush, Improved Trip, and Mobility for your feat selections. Then at level 10, we get Medusa's Wrath and Improved Critical. Now, Medusa's Wrath, it does require a bit of setup. The character needs to be stunned, which is where your Stunning Fist ability comes in. But once they are stunned, and you can do both Stunning Fist and Medusa's Wrath as part of your Flurry of Blows without interrupting that, you use Stunning Fist to set them up, and then Medusa's Wrath to just absolutely punish them for being stupid enough to get close to you. The next ability we get is an AC bonus, a bonus to your armor class, which you absolutely need. Because as a monk, you're not allowed to wear armor, otherwise it interferes with your abilities. This is one of the abilities it interferes with, because you use your wisdom modifier as a bonus to your armor class as a trade-off for not being able to wear armor. This is why wisdom is important. One of the reasons why. Although the bonuses you get from here, other than just getting to use your wisdom modifier, are not the greatest. You get an extra +1 to your armor at 4th level, and then every 4 levels thereafter, capping out at a +5 at level 20. It's useful, but I kind of wish it'd come in at 1st level rather than 4th level, or even 2nd level would be acceptable, because monks, especially early on, need all the bonuses they can get for their armor class. Darn right. Darn right. So then, next up, we get a chi pool. Now, the chi pool is incredibly handy for the monk, and there are some abilities associated with it that I'll get into and cover later, but the chi pool, you gain a goodness, a chi pool that is equal to 1/2 your monk level plus your wisdom modifier, which will be a 5 if you're following this build. We also get Still Mind at 3rd level, which gives you a +2 will save bonus versus enchantment spells and spell-like effects, which, again, like I said, given the whole host of array of abilities that can affect your character through your will save, and enchantment spells are certainly some of the worst things to have thrown on you, spells that can turn you against your friends, you really want to have all the extra oomph you can get out of that. Then we also get fast movement at 3rd level, which gives you plus 10 movement for every 3 levels. Oh, I'm sorry, and at every 3 levels, this increases by another 10 feet. So dwarves, one of the penalties that they have here, other than the hit to charisma, is that their base speed is a 20 feet instead of 30, but the trade-off with that is that they can carry heavy loads and not be considered slowed. But the abilities of the monk with fast movement just mesh so well because it makes up for that little deficiency there. So you can be carrying a crazy amount of weight and still be hustling through without having your speed impacted negatively. Really actually is handy for rescue situations, but that's a story for another time. We also get evasion, and evasion is great. It comes in early enough at 2nd level to be incredibly useful from the start and going forward. With evasion, on a successful reflex save, you are taking no damage instead of half damage, and given that you're unarmored, you're using a d8 for hit points. Saving as many hit points as you can, as often as you can, is useful. Also, monks get maneuver training, where they are using their monk level instead of base attack bonus for their combat maneuver bonus abilities. So, tripping, bull rushing, grappling, these will all work off of their maneuver training, and instead of using the monk's okay attack progression, they use the character level, so they're treated like a fighter would be. From there, I think we are going to go ahead and just pause everything for now. We're going to cover. My co-host seems to agree with me. It's time to take a break. We will come back and cover the other half of the monk's abilities at another time. We have been your hosts. I've been Jordan, your Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. Nora has been your Learner Initiate and Junior Storyteller in Training. If you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving us a like. And if you've been enjoying the content so far, maybe even give us a subscription. Can always use more subscribers here, but if you do subscribe, click the bell icon over there so that way you get hopefully notified the next time I upload more content here. And really, if you have any feedback, go ahead and leave it down in the comments below. Even if it's good, bad, derisive, I will enjoy reading it and I will enjoy having the comments there. But for now, you all have yourselves a good night. Thank you for your time.